Sometimes the mind notices something before you do. A shift in the room, a silence that feels wrong. You tell yourself it's nothing because that's easier. The people in tonight's stories did the same, until they couldn't anymore. I'm LURK. Leave a like, subscribe, and let's begin. I was very young when this happened, so some parts of the memory feel blurry in the way childhood memories often do. But there are certain details that have stayed perfectly clear in my mind for years. Even now, long after it happened, I can still picture that house, that hallway, and the strange sound that used to wake me up in the middle of the night. When I was a child, my mother and I lived in an old Victorian house. It was the kind of house that looked beautiful from the outside, but carried a strange atmosphere once you were inside. The ceilings were high, the doors were heavy, and the floors creaked with almost every step. It was the sort of place that seemed to hold on to its past. My mother raised me by herself, so it was always just the two of us in that house. During the day, it felt normal. Sunlight would come through the tall windows, and I was very young when this happened. So some parts of the memory feel blurry in the way childhood memories often do, but there are certain details that have stayed perfectly clear in my mind for years. Even now, long after it happened, I can still picture that house, that hallway, and the strange sound that used to wake me up in the middle of the night. When I was a child, my mother and I lived in an old Victorian house. It was the kind of house that looked beautiful from the outside, but carried a strange atmosphere once you were inside. The ceilings were high, the doors were heavy, and the floors creaked with almost every step. It was the sort of place that seemed to hold on to its past. My mother raised me by herself, so it was always just the two of us in that house. During the day, it felt normal. Sunlight would come through the tall windows, and the house would feel warm and quiet. But at night, everything changed. Once the lights were off and the rooms went dark, the house seemed much larger than it really was. The long hallway outside my bedroom always felt especially eerie at night. I was around 5 or 6 years old when the strange things started happening. Some nights I would wake up suddenly, and when I did, I would hear laughter coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. At first, it was faint. It sounded like someone laughing quietly, or almost like they were trying not to be heard. It wasn't loud, and it didn't echo through the house. Instead, it sounded close enough that it felt like whoever was laughing was standing right outside my door. The first few times it happened, I didn't know what to think. I would lie there in my bed, staring toward the door in the darkness, trying to listen carefully. Sometimes the laughter would last only a few seconds before stopping. Other times it would continue long enough to make my stomach twist, with a feeling I didn't fully understand yet. It wasn't the kind of laughter that sounded happy. There was something strange about it. Even as a child, I could tell it didn't feel normal. Eventually, I told my mother about it. One evening, before going to bed, I mentioned that sometimes I heard laughing in the hallway at night. I remember explaining it in the simple way kids do, telling her that someone was laughing outside my room when I was trying to sleep. My mom listened, but she didn't seem worried. She smiled gently and told me it was probably just the television. Sometimes she would fall asleep with the TV still on in the living room. The house was old and the walls carried sound easily, so she said the laughter I heard was probably just coming from whatever show was playing late at night. Her explanation made sense to me at the time. I trusted her, and I wanted to believe that was all it was. But the laughter kept happening, not every night, but often enough that I started to expect it. Sometimes I would wake up already feeling tense, listening carefully for that quiet sound outside the door. And then one night, something happened that I will never forget. I woke up suddenly, just like before. But this time something was different immediately. The laughter wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my room. At first I thought I was still dreaming. My room was dark, and for a moment I couldn't understand what was happening. The laughter sounded closer than ever before. It felt like it was somewhere near my bed. My heart started pounding. I remember trying to sit up, but when I tried to move, I couldn't. It felt like something was holding me down. I could feel pressure on both of my shoulders. Strong pressure. The kind of pressure that felt exactly like someone's hands gripping into me. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel the weight. 2 hands pressing down on my shoulders, keeping me pinned to the mattress. I tried to move again, but the pressure didn't let up. The laughter continued. It sounded right next to me. That was the moment when pure panic took over. I was just a small child, and I didn't understand what was happening. All I knew was that something invisible seemed to be holding me down while laughing in my room. I started screaming. I screamed as loud as I could. I screamed for my mom over and over again, my voice cracking as the fear poured out of me. Within seconds, I heard my bedroom door fly open. My mom rushed into the room and immediately turned on the lamp beside my bed. The sudden light filled the room, chasing away the darkness. The moment the light came on, the pressure on my shoulders disappeared. Just like that, it was gone. My mother hurried to my bed and tried to calm me down. I was crying so hard that I could barely explain what had happened. My chest hurt from screaming and my whole body was shaking. She kept telling me everything was okay. She said it must have been a bad dream. Sometimes dreams can feel incredibly real when you wake up suddenly, especially when you're a child. That was the explanation she gave me as she tried to soothe me. Eventually, my crying slowed down, but then I said something that made her pause. I told her my shoulders hurt. At first, she didn't react much. She probably thought I had just strained them when I struggled in bed. But to make sure everything was fine, she gently lifted up my t-shirt to check. The moment she saw my shoulders, her expression changed. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I remember her face going completely still. There were marks on my shoulders, 2 handprints. They weren't small marks either. They looked exactly like the shape of adult hands pressing firmly into my skin. My mother didn't scream or panic. Instead, she slowly pulled my shirt back down and continued telling me everything was fine. She repeated that it must have been a dream and that I was safe. But I could tell something had unsettled her. She stayed in my room with me for a long time that night until I finally fell asleep again. As the years passed, the memory slowly faded into the strange collection of things that happened during childhood. I eventually convinced myself that maybe I had imagined most of it. Kids have active imaginations. That's what people say all the time. So I stopped thinking about it. For years, the story stayed buried somewhere in the back of my mind. Then recently, something happened that brought it back in a way I never expected. I was talking with my mother about random childhood memories. It was one of those casual conversations where old stories come up without much thought. At one point, I mentioned the night I thought something had grabbed my shoulders. I said it lightly, almost like a joke. But the moment I said it, my mother's face changed completely. The color drained from her face. She went completely pale. I had never seen her react like that before. For a moment, she didn't say anything at all. The room went quiet, and I could tell that something about the memory had affected her deeply. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet and serious. She said she didn't want to remember that night. Those exact words. I don't want to remember that. The way she said it made something inside me feel cold, because it meant she remembered exactly what she saw on my shoulders that night. And whatever explanation she had found for it over the years was something she clearly didn't want to revisit again. Would feel warm and quiet. But at night, everything changed. Once the lights were off and the rooms went dark, the house seemed much larger than it really was. The long hallway outside my bedroom always felt especially eerie at night. I was around 5 or 6 years old when the strange things started happening. Some nights I would wake up suddenly, and when I did, I would hear laughter coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. At first, it was faint. It sounded like someone laughing quietly, almost like they were trying not to be heard. It wasn't loud, and it didn't echo through the house. Instead, it sounded close enough that it felt like whoever was laughing was standing right outside my door. The first few times it happened, I didn't know what to think. I would lie there in my bed, staring toward the door in the darkness, trying to listen carefully. Sometimes the laughter would last only a few seconds before stopping. Other times it would continue long enough to make my stomach twist, with a feeling I didn't fully understand yet. It wasn't the kind of laughter that sounded happy. There was something strange about it. Even as a child, I could tell it didn't feel normal. Eventually, I told my mother about it. One evening, before going to bed, I mentioned that sometimes I heard laughing in the hallway at night. I remember explaining it in the simple way kids do, telling her that someone was laughing outside my room when I was trying to sleep. My mom listened, but she didn't seem worried. She smiled gently and told me it was probably just the television. Sometimes she would fall asleep with the TV still on in the living room. The house was old and the walls carried sound easily, so she said the laughter I heard was probably just coming from whatever show was playing late at night. Her explanation made sense to me at the time. I trusted her, and I wanted to believe that was all it was. But the laughter kept happening. Not every night, but often enough that I started to expect it. Sometimes I would wake up already feeling tense, listening carefully for that quiet sound outside the door. And then one night, something happened that I will never forget. I woke up suddenly just like before, but this time something was different immediately. The laughter wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my room. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. My room was dark, and for a moment I couldn't understand what was happening. But the laughter sounded closer than ever before. It felt like it was somewhere near my bed. My heart started pounding. I remember trying to sit up, but when I tried to move, I couldn't. It felt like something was holding me down. I could feel pressure on both of my shoulders. Strong pressure. The kind of pressure that felt exactly like someone's hands gripping into me. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel the weight. 2 hands pressing down on my shoulders, keeping me pinned to the mattress. Now I tried to move again, but the pressure didn't let up. The laughter continued. It sounded right next to me. That was the moment when pure panic took over. I was just a small child, and I didn't understand what was happening. All I knew was that something invisible seemed to be holding me down while laughing in my room. I started screaming. I screamed as loud as I could. I screamed for my mom over and over again, my voice cracking as the fear poured out of me. Within seconds, I heard my bedroom door fly open. My mom rushed into the room and immediately turned on the lamp beside my bed. The sudden light filled the room, chasing away the darkness. The moment the light came on, the pressure on my shoulders disappeared. Just like that. It was gone. My mother hurried to my bed and tried to calm me down. I was crying so hard that I could barely explain what had happened. My chest hurt from screaming and my whole body was shaking. She kept telling me everything was okay. She said it must have been a bad dream. Sometimes dreams can feel incredibly real when you wake up suddenly, especially when you're a child. That was the explanation she gave me as she tried to soothe me. Eventually, my crying slowed down. But then I said something that made her pause. I told her my shoulders hurt. At first, she didn't react much. She probably thought I had just strained them when I struggled in bed. But to make sure everything was fine, she gently lifted up my t-shirt to check. The moment she saw my shoulders, her expression changed. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I remember her face going completely still. There were marks on my shoulders, 2 handprints, They weren't small marks, either. They looked exactly like the shape of adult hands pressing firmly into my skin. My mother didn't scream or panic. Instead, she slowly pulled my shirt back down and continued telling me everything was fine. She repeated that it must have been a dream and that I was safe, but I could tell something had unsettled her. She stayed in my room with me for a long time that night until I finally fell asleep again. As the years passed, the memory slowly faded into the strange collection of things that happened during childhood. I eventually convinced myself that maybe I had imagined most of it. Kids have active imaginations. That's what people say all the time. So I stopped thinking about it. For years, the story stayed buried somewhere in the back of my mind. Then recently something happened that brought it back in a way I never expected. I was talking with my mother about random childhood memories. It was one of those casual conversations where old stories come up without much thought. At one point I mentioned the night I thought something had grabbed my shoulders. I said it lightly, almost like a joke. But the moment I said it, my mother's face changed completely. The color drained from her face. She went completely pale. I had never seen her react like that before. For a moment she didn't say anything at all. The room went quiet, and I could tell that something about the memory had affected her deeply. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet and serious. She said she didn't want to remember that night. Those exact words. I don't want to remember that. The way she said it made something inside me feel cold, because it meant she remembered exactly what she saw on my shoulders that night. And whatever explanation she had found for it over the years was something she clearly didn't want to revisit again. This happened when my brother and I were still pretty young. I was around 11 years old at the time, and my brother was about 16. Our parents had gone out for the evening, which wasn't unusual for us. We had been left home alone plenty of times before. My brother was old enough to keep an eye on things, and we were both used to spending a few quiet hours in the house until our parents came back later in the night. The house we lived in was a small bungalow. It wasn't a big place, but the layout made it feel a little strange sometimes, especially at night. The 3 bedrooms were all located down a hallway that separated them from the rest of the house. At the other end of the hallway were the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen. That meant that if you were sitting in the living room like we were that night, the entire hallway leading to the bedroom stretched out in front of you like a narrow tunnel. During the day, it didn't feel like anything special. It was just a normal hallway. But at night, when the house was quiet and the lights were dim, it always felt a little different. Something about the narrow space and the way shadows settled along the walls made it feel darker than the rest of the house. Even with the lights on, the hallway always seemed to hold onto a kind of quiet tension that made you want to walk through it quickly instead of standing there too long. That night, my brother and I were sitting in the living room watching television. The lights were on, and the TV was loud enough to fill the room with sound. Outside the windows, everything was completely dark. The neighborhood had already settled down for the night, and the silence outside made the house feel even quieter by comparison. We were relaxed, just sitting on the couch watching whatever show was on at the time. I remember feeling comfortable and calm, not thinking about anything strange or unusual. Then suddenly the quiet evening was interrupted. From down the hallway, coming from the direction of the bedrooms, my stereo turned on. Not quietly, it exploded into sound at full volume. The music blasted through the hallway so loudly that it echoed straight into the living room. The sudden noise made both of us jump. One moment everything had been quiet except for the television, and the next moment music was blasting through the house like someone had deliberately turned the volume all the way up. We both looked toward the hallway at the exact same time. The stereo was in my bedroom at the far end of the hall. There was no one else in the house who could have turned it on. At least, that's what we thought. For a moment, we just sat there staring at each other. The strange part was that this kind of thing had actually happened before. There had been other times when things in the house made noise by themselves. There was a jewelry box that played music when it was opened, and every once in a while it would start playing its little tune, even though nobody had touched it. That had always been enough to make me uncomfortable. But hearing my stereo suddenly blast music in the middle of the night was much worse. I hated when things like that happened. It always made my stomach tighten with that nervous feeling you get when something doesn't seem quite right. And to make things worse, the hallway light didn't always work properly. Sometimes when you flipped the switch, nothing happened. The bulb wouldn't turn on even though it worked at other times. It was one of those annoying little problems in the house that never seemed important enough for anyone to fix. But when you were a kid staring down a dark hallway, that broken light switch suddenly felt like a much bigger problem. The stereo was still blasting music from my room, loud and echoing down the hallway. Someone had to go turn it off. I didn't want to sit there listening to it any longer, so I jumped up from the couch and started running toward the hallway. I didn't stop to think about it. I just wanted the noise to stop. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, the air felt different. The living room behind me was bright and full of sound from the television, but the hallway ahead of me felt darker and strangely quiet except for the music blasting from my room. I ran forward quickly, my footsteps echoing against the floor as I moved toward the bedrooms. The closer I got to the end of the hallway, the louder the stereo became. The sound bounced off the walls in a way that made it feel even more overwhelming. I was almost at my bedroom door. Just a few more steps and I would reach it. Then something happened that I still can't explain. It felt like I ran straight into something. Not a wall, not a piece of furniture. Something solid that wasn't supposed to be there. The impact was sudden and strong. My entire body stopped instantly, like I had slammed into a person standing directly in front of me. Before I could even process what was happening, the force knocked me backwards. My feet flew out from under me and I crashed onto the floor hard. The back of my head hit the ground with a loud thud that sent a sharp pain through my skull. For a second, my vision blurred and everything felt disoriented. I lay there on the floor, stunned. The stereo was still blasting music from inside my room, but the hallway around me was empty, completely empty. My brother had followed me down the hallway after I ran toward my room. He had seen everything happen from where he stood. It looked like I had run forward and then suddenly been thrown backwards for no reason. He rushed over to me immediately, asking if I was okay, but both of us were too shocked to say much. We both looked down the hallway toward my bedroom. There was nothing there. No person standing in front of me. No object that I could have hit. Nothing blocking the hallway at all. But I knew exactly what it had felt like. I hadn't just tripped. I had hit something. Was something solid enough to stop me in my tracks and knock me back onto the floor. We both stood there staring at the empty space where I had run. The music from my stereo continued blasting from inside my room, but suddenly neither of us wanted to go any farther down that hallway. The house felt different now. The same place that had felt normal and comfortable just minutes earlier suddenly felt tense and quiet. Yet eventually we forced ourselves to walk down the rest of the hallway and turn the stereo off. Neither of us said much while we did it. We just moved quickly, like we wanted to get the whole thing over with. Once the music stopped, the silence in the house returned. But the feeling of what had just happened stayed with us, because the truth was simple. There was nothing standing in that hallway, and yet somehow, when I ran toward my room, I ran straight into something that wasn't there. This happened when I was living in a small house with my cousin and another roommate. It was the kind of place that looked completely normal from the outside. If you drove past it during the day, nothing about it would seem unusual. It was just another house on a quiet street with a small yard and a simple layout inside. But the people who actually lived there knew something about that house that outsiders didn't. The place had a strange reputation. Before we even moved in, there had already been stories about things happening inside that house. At first, we didn't take them very seriously. Most people assume that ghost stories are just exaggerations or people scaring themselves with their own imagination. But after living there for a while, we started noticing things that were hard to explain. Small things at first. Strange sounds in the middle of the night. Footsteps that didn't seem to belong to anyone in the house. Doors that sometimes moved slightly, even when there was no wind. None of it was dramatic enough to prove anything. It was just enough to make the house feel uncomfortable sometimes. Over time, we started to believe that something really was there. The strangest part was that the activity often seemed connected to what sounded like a child. There were nights when we would hear soft footsteps moving through the hallway, even though everyone in the house was in their rooms. Sometimes we would hear what sounded like a small voice, almost like a child talking quietly somewhere in the house. At first, we tried to ignore it, but after hearing it enough times, it became impossible not to notice. Eventually, half joking and half serious, we started referring to the child as Timmy. We had no idea if that name meant anything. It was just something that stuck after one conversation. And after that, we always used it when we talked about whatever presence seemed to be in the house. But Timmy wasn't the only strange thing connected to that place. Before we lived there, our roommate had shared the house with his previous roommate, who was also his girlfriend at the time. She had experienced things that were even harder to explain. She used to tell us about how she would sometimes see figures in the bathroom while she was showering. Not clear, solid figures. More like shapes or shadows that looked like people standing just outside the shower curtain. At first, she thought she was imagining things because of the steam and the way light reflects in the bathroom mirror. But the experiences kept happening often enough that she became convinced something was actually there. The most disturbing part was that sometimes she felt something physically touch her. She told us there were times when she felt a sudden push while she was getting ready in the bathroom. Not strong enough to hurt her, but enough that she would stumble or feel like someone had shoved her from behind. Hearing those stories definitely made the house feel more unsettling. Still, life went on. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happened. We would hang out in the living room, watch TV, drink a few beers, and try not to think too much about the strange stories connected to the place. One night, though, something happened that none of us could explain. It was a normal evening. My cousin and I were standing in the kitchen having a beer and talking about random things the way people do when they're just relaxing at home. Our roommate was in the living room, stretched out on the couch, watching television. The house felt calm and quiet. Nothing strange had happened that day. We were just enjoying a quiet night. On the kitchen counter, there was a small container of beer salt. It was something we sometimes used with drinks, and it happened to be sitting there next to us while we were talking. For some reason, the conversation drifted toward the topic of the house again. We joked about Timmy the way we had done many times before. At that moment, I picked up the container of beer salt and set it on its side on the counter. Then, half joking and half curious, I said something out loud. I said, "Timmy, if you're really here, spin this beer salt." I said it in a joking tone, like someone teasing an invisible audience. My cousin immediately reacted. He looked at me and told me to stop. He didn't like the idea of taunting whatever might be in the house. Even though we often joked about the strange things we had experienced, actually challenging something unseen suddenly made the situation feel a little more serious. For a moment, nothing happened. The beer salt just sat there on its side. The kitchen stayed completely still. My cousin and I looked at each other and laughed nervously, realizing how ridiculous the moment probably looked. It felt like one of those situations where you scare yourself with your own imagination and then laugh it off once you realize nothing is actually happening. But the moment our nervous laughter faded, something happened that changed everything. Every door in the house slammed open, not just one door, all of them. The front door, the bedroom doors, the bathroom doors, every single one of them suddenly burst open at the exact same time. The sound was explosive. The house filled with the noise of wood slamming against walls and doorstops all at once. It echoed through every room like a sudden violent gust of energy had rushed through the entire building. The force of it made both of us jump back from the counter. From the living room, we heard our roommate shout in shock. He had been lying on the couch watching television when it happened. The sudden explosion of noise startled him so badly that he literally jumped from one couch to another and then ran into the living room trying to figure out what had just happened. For a moment, all three of us just stood there in stunned silence. Every door in the house was now standing wide open, the front door included, but the deadbolt was still locked. We could see it clearly. The door had slammed open against the limit of the lock, leaving it hanging partially open but still secured by the bolt. None of the windows were open. There was no wind. The air inside the house was completely still, and yet somehow every single door had flown open at the same exact moment. None of us spoke for several seconds. We just looked around the house, trying to understand what we had just seen. There was no explanation, no sound of anyone outside, no sign of anything moving through the rooms. Just silence. The same silence that had been there before everything happened, except now every door in the house stood open like something had forced them all apart at once. Eventually, one of us walked over and slowly pushed the front door closed again. The deadbolt was still locked exactly the way it had been before. Nothing about the house looked different, except for what had just happened. None of us laughed about Timmy after that, and none of us ever joked about challenging whatever might have been in that house again. From that night forward, we made a silent agreement without even saying it out loud. We would never taunt Timmy again. When I was a kid, my family lived in a house that everyone in the neighborhood quietly believed was haunted. At the time, I didn't fully understand what that meant. Adults would sometimes whisper about strange things that had happened there. But when you're young, you mostly just accept the place you live in as normal. Looking back now, though, there were many things about that house that felt strange, even when I was a child. We lived there until I was about 10 years old. The house itself wasn't huge, but it had a very old feeling to it. The floors creaked constantly, the walls made noises late at night, and certain rooms always felt colder than the rest of the house, no matter what season it was. Even as a kid, I noticed that sometimes the house felt different, depending on the time of day. During the afternoon, everything felt normal, almost peaceful. But early in the morning or late at night, the place could feel heavy and quiet in a way that made you aware of every little sound around you. The basement was where most of the strange feelings seemed to gather. Like a lot of older houses, our basement was partly finished and partly just a utility area. One section had some furniture and a television where we kept an old video game console. The other section had the washing machine, dryer, and a few shelves where my dad kept tools and random household things. See, as a kid, I loved going down there because that was where the video games were. I would sometimes sneak down early in the morning before anyone else in the house woke up. One particular morning stands out clearly in my memory. I woke up extremely early, around 4 in the morning. At that age, it's frustrating when you wake up before everyone else because there isn't much to do. I tried lying in bed and closing my eyes again, but sleep wouldn't come back. After tossing around for a while, I decided to get up. The house was completely silent. My parents were asleep, and the sky outside was still dark. I quietly walked down the stairs to the basement and turned on the television. The blue glow from the screen lit up the room as I started playing one of my favorite games. For the next couple of hours, that's all I did. I sat there in the quiet basement playing video games while the world outside slowly moved toward morning. Eventually, I got bored. Now, 2 hours is a long time for a kid to sit in one place, and the excitement of sneaking downstairs early had worn off. When I finally looked up from the screen, I noticed something else. The darkness outside was starting to fade. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but the faint gray light of early morning was beginning to appear through the small basement windows. I turned off the game and stood up, stretching a little after sitting for so long. At that point, I wandered into the laundry room area of the basement. My dad had hung a dartboard on the wall down there, and sometimes I would mess around throwing darts at it just to pass time. So that's what I did. I picked up the darts and started throwing them one by one at the board. It was quiet except for the small sound of each dart hitting the cork surface. The room smelled faintly like laundry detergent and the cool dampness that basements sometimes have. The washing machine and dryer sat quietly against one wall. I remember feeling calm and relaxed. There was something peaceful about being the only one awake in the house, while the day slowly began outside. I probably stood there throwing darts for about 20 minutes. Eventually, I finished the small game I had made up for myself and turned around to walk back toward the basement stairs. That's when I saw him. Standing only a few feet away from me was a man. For a moment, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. He was dressed in clothing that didn't look modern at all. Even as a kid, I could tell the style looked very old, like something you would see in black and white photographs from many decades ago. The thing I remember most clearly was the hat. He was wearing a tall top hat, the kind of hat you might see in old movies set in the early 1900s. His clothes looked like they belonged to that same time period. The style was formal, almost like the way people dressed in the 1930s. I stood there completely frozen. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared. The man looked directly at me. His expression wasn't angry or threatening. If anything, he looked calm, almost polite. Then he did something that made the moment even stranger. He slowly lifted his hand and tipped his hat toward me. The gesture was small but deliberate, like a greeting. After tipping his hat, he smiled. It wasn't a big grin or anything dramatic, just a simple smile, the kind someone might give when acknowledging another person. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't rush. He didn't vanish suddenly. He simply walked calmly across the basement and out of my view. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. My body felt stiff and heavy, like my brain hadn't caught up to what had just happened. I remember staring at the space where he had disappeared, trying to understand what I had just seen. At 8 years old, your mind doesn't immediately jump to the idea of ghosts or anything supernatural. I think part of me assumed there must be some logical explanation. Maybe someone had come into the house somehow. Maybe I was still half asleep. But at the same time, I knew something about the situation didn't make sense. Eventually, I went back upstairs. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen that morning. Part of the reason was that I wasn't sure how to explain it. Now, another part was that kids sometimes worry about sounding crazy when they say they saw something unusual, so I kept the experience to myself. Years passed. The memory stayed with me, but I rarely talked about it. When I was about 15 years old, the subject of that house came up during a conversation with my dad. We were talking about strange things that had happened while we lived there. That was when I finally decided to mention the man I had seen in the basement years earlier. I described exactly what I remembered: the top hat, the old-fashioned clothes, the way he tipped his hat and smiled before walking away. When I finished telling the story, I expected my dad to laugh it off or say I must have imagined it. Instead, his reaction shocked me. He went completely still. Then he looked at me and said something I will never forget. He said, "Holy shit, you saw him too?" The way he said it made it clear that he wasn't joking. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who had seen that man in that house. And hearing that from my dad made the memory of that quiet morning in the basement feel a lot stranger than it ever had before. If these stories feel familiar, there's a reason. Most people have experienced something they don't talk about. If you're still listening, leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep stories like these alive. And if something has ever followed you home, send it in. Let's continue. I am a high school teacher, and for most of my career, I have developed a habit of staying late after the school day ends. Some teachers like to leave right when the bell rings, but I have always been the type who prefers a quiet building when I work. After the students leave, the hallways become calm, and it's much easier to focus on grading papers, planning lessons, or catching up on work that piles up during the day. Because of that habit, it's not unusual for me to leave school long after everyone else has gone home. Most days I stay until the evening, sometimes even later depending on how busy the week is. Over the years, I became very comfortable with the routine. Walking through empty hallways and quiet courtyards became normal for me. About 2 years ago, something happened that completely changed the way I feel about staying late. It was a normal weekday, nothing special about it. I had spent the afternoon grading tests and preparing material for the next week. Time slipped by the way it often does when you're focused on work, and before I knew it, the building had become completely quiet. When I finally checked the clock, it was around 8 p.m. By that time, almost everyone had already left. Occasionally there might be a club meeting, a sports practice, or the dance team using the gym, but on that particular night the campus felt unusually empty. I gathered my things, so I turned off the lights in my classroom and stepped outside. The moment I walked out of the building, I noticed how dark it was. The area of the school where my classroom was located had several outdoor lights that were supposed to illuminate the walkway leading toward the quad and the parking lot. Unfortunately, that year the school district had been cutting back on spending, and maintenance had been slow to fix things that broke. Those lights had been out for months, so when you stepped outside at night, the path between the buildings was almost completely dark. Normally that didn't bother me too much. I had walked that same route hundreds of times and knew it well enough that I didn't need much light to navigate it. From my classroom door, the path to the parking lot required a simple turn to the left. After that, you walk through a narrow outdoor passage between two structures. On the left side was the building where my classroom was located. See, on the right side were several portable classrooms. These were temporary structures placed on campus years earlier to handle growing class sizes. Over time, they had simply become permanent parts of the school. Between the main building and the portables, there was about 10 feet of open space. The path ran straight between them like a narrow outdoor hallway, stretching from one end of the campus to the other. During the day, students walked through that space constantly. But at night, it felt very different. The tall walls on either side created shadows, and without working lights, the entire area became dark enough that you had to rely on the faint glow of distant streetlights to see where you were going. I stepped into that dark walkway and began walking toward the quad. and the front parking lot where my car was parked. My mind was somewhere else at the time. I was thinking about upcoming tests, the drive home, and the list of things I still needed to do the next day. It was the kind of quiet walk I had taken many times before. Then I heard something behind me. At first it was faint, the sound of footsteps. They were coming from somewhere behind me down the walkway. My first thought was that it was probably a student. Even though most activities had ended by then, it wasn't unusual for a few kids to still be around campus. Sometimes clubs ran late or sports teams stayed longer than expected. The footsteps sounded like someone running, quick, rapid steps hitting the concrete walkway. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was a student who had just come around the corner of the building behind me and was heading toward the same direction I was walking, so I kept moving forward without turning around. The footsteps continued. At first they sounded far away, but gradually they became louder. Whoever it was seemed to be running directly toward me. The sound echoed slightly between the two walls on either side of the walkway. The concrete amplified the noise so that every step bounced around the narrow space. Step after step. Closer. Faster. The footsteps grew louder with every second. It sounded exactly like someone sprinting toward me from behind. At that point, I figured the person would probably run right past me on the path. Maybe they were trying to catch up with someone or just messing around. So I shifted slightly to my left side of the walkway to give them room to pass on my right. The sound of the running steps continued getting closer. By then it felt like whoever it was only a few feet behind me. I could clearly hear the rhythm of shoes hitting the concrete. The echo of each step bounced sharply off the walls. For a moment I braced myself for someone to rush past me. Then something strange happened. The footsteps stopped. Not gradually, not fading away. They stopped instantly, exactly at the moment when it sounded like the runner was directly behind me. The silence that followed was sudden and unnatural. For a moment I just stood there, confused. I had clearly heard someone running right behind me. The sound had been unmistakable, but no one had passed me. That was when a chill ran down my spine. I slowly stopped walking. Then I turned around. The walkway behind me was empty, completely empty. There was no one there, no students, no teachers, no one. I looked down the path toward the far end of the walkway. The opening between the buildings was still at least 50 feet away. Beyond that was another open stretch that extended roughly 200 feet to the far side of campus. There was nowhere for someone to disappear. No doors nearby, no corners to hide behind. Nothing. Still, I turned around again just to be sure. I spun in a full circle, scanning the darkness around me. The area was silent. No movement, no footsteps. No one running away. Just the empty walkway and the faint sound of wind moving through distant trees. I stood there for several seconds trying to process what had just happened. I knew what I had heard. The sound of footsteps had been clear and unmistakable. The echoes off the concrete walls had made them impossible to ignore. Someone had been running toward me, and then suddenly, no one was there. I finished the rest of the walk to my car much faster than usual that night. As I crossed the quad and reached the parking lot, I kept glancing back toward the dark walkway behind me. Nothing followed. The campus was quiet. I drove home that night, replaying the moment in my mind again and again. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe someone had been there and quickly ducked into a classroom or doorway before I turned around. But there were no doors along that stretch of walkway. Maybe someone had run back the way they came. But the sound of running footsteps stopping suddenly behind me didn't match that idea. The only explanations I could come up with were strange ones. Either I had somehow experienced an auditory hallucination from being tired and overworked, or something had been there that I couldn't see. I never found out which one it was, but I can tell you one thing. Within the next year, I made sure those broken lights in that walkway were finally fixed. When I was 8 years old, something happened that I still think about even now. A lot of things from childhood fade away over time. Small moments disappear, details blur together, and sometimes you can't even remember exactly when certain things happened. But every once in a while, there's a memory that stays exactly the way it was, almost like a photograph burned into your mind. This is one of those memories for me. I can still see it clearly. The house, the hallway, and most of all, the face of the man I saw standing in the kitchen. At the time, I was in 3rd grade, and it was the middle of summer. School had been out for a while, and like most kids my age, I had way too much free time. My days usually revolved around riding my bike, playing outside, or going over to friends' houses. One friend in particular lived close enough that I could visit him pretty often. I probably went over there about once a week, sometimes more depending on what we had planned that day. Most of the time we did the same thing every kid our age was doing back then. We played video games. He had a PlayStation 3, which at the time felt like the greatest thing in the world. I didn't have one at my house yet, so whenever I went over there, it was basically guaranteed that we'd spend hours sitting in his living room, playing whatever game we were obsessed with that week. Sometimes it was racing games, sometimes shooters, sometimes sports games where we'd argue over who got to pick the teams. The living room where we played was pretty comfortable. There was a large television mounted across from a couch that was just big enough for both of us to sit on with our controllers. There was usually a small pile of snacks nearby, and sometimes a couple of empty soda cans sitting on the table from earlier in the day. It was the kind of casual mess that comes from kids spending hours playing games without paying attention to anything else. But there was one thing about my friend that always stood out to me. He was really into paranormal stuff. Even at 8 years old, he had this strange fascination with ghosts, haunted houses, and creepy supernatural stories. Whenever we weren't playing games, he'd sometimes talk about weird things he thought had happened in his house or stories he had seen online. Looking back now, it's kind of funny. At the time, though, I honestly thought he was a little crazy. Every small noise in his house would turn into some kind of ghost theory. If something creaked upstairs, he'd say it was a spirit moving around. If a door closed by itself, he'd start talking about haunted rooms. I never believed any of it. Even back then, I thought he was stretching things way too far. To me, it just sounded like imagination mixed with boredom. We were kids. And kids sometimes like to make ordinary things sound scary. One afternoon that summer started just like every other visit. I came over sometime in the early afternoon. I don't remember the exact time, but the sun was still high and bright outside. We went straight into the living room and turned on the PlayStation like we always did. For the next couple of hours, we sat there playing games. We talked about random things while playing, by arguing about scores and laughing whenever one of us messed up in the game. The room felt normal and comfortable. Nothing strange about the house stood out to me at all. Eventually, after playing for a while, I started feeling thirsty. It was the kind of simple thing you don't even think about. I just realized I wanted something to drink. So I paused the game, stood up from the couch, and told my friend I was going to grab a drink from the kitchen. He barely reacted. He kept staring at the television, controller in his hands, completely focused on whatever was happening in the game. I walked away from the living room and headed toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. The hallway itself wasn't long. It was just a short stretch that connected the living room to the kitchen area. I had walked down it plenty of times before without even thinking about it. Everything felt completely normal, quiet, ordinary. I walked down the hallway and turned the corner into the kitchen, and that's when everything changed. Standing in the kitchen was an old man. I saw him immediately. He was only a few feet away from me, standing there like he had been there the entire time. There was no chance that I was seeing shadows or shapes or something confusing in the room. He was clearly visible. He looked very old. His hair was thin and gray, and his face had deep wrinkles across his forehead. and around his eyes. Yeah, but the thing that stuck with me the most was the expression on his face. He looked angry, not mildly annoyed, not confused, genuinely angry. His eyes were locked directly on me, and his expression was cold and intense in a way that made my stomach feel tight. For a moment I couldn't move. When something unexpected happens, your brain sometimes needs a second to understand what your eyes are seeing. I just stood there staring at him. He didn't say anything. He didn't move toward me. He simply stood there looking directly at me with that same angry expression. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. My mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. I had been to my friend's house many times before. I had met his parents. I had met relatives who visited sometimes. This man was not someone I recognized. Then suddenly something happened that made the situation even stranger. He disappeared, not by walking away, not by stepping behind something. He simply vanished. One moment he was standing there. The next moment the space where he had been standing was completely empty, gone, just like that. I remember blinking several times and looking around the kitchen, trying to figure out what had just happened. There was nowhere for someone to go that quickly. There were no doors near him that could have opened and closed without me hearing them. There was no hallway behind him that he could have slipped into. He had simply disappeared. Strangely enough, I didn't scream. I didn't run. Even now, I still don't understand why. Most kids would probably panic if they saw something like that, but I just stood there staring at the empty space where he had been standing. Then I slowly walked into the kitchen and looked around. Everything looked normal, completely normal. After a moment, I grabbed a drink like I originally planned and walked back into the living room. My friend was still sitting there playing the game. He looked at me and asked what took so long. I shrugged and sat back down. I didn't tell him what I had seen. Part of me didn't want to encourage his obsession with paranormal stories. If I told him that I had just seen an old man appear and disappear in his kitchen, he would probably talk about it for the rest of the day. So I kept it to myself. But even now, after all these years, I can still see that man's face clearly. The angry look, the way he stared directly at me, and the way he vanished like he had never been there at all. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I had stood there longer instead of walking away. This story didn't happen to me directly. It happened to my husband when he was a kid. Even though it happened many years ago, it's something he still remembers very clearly. Every time he tells the story, he describes the same details in the same way, like the memory never faded over time. The strange part is that nothing about the situation should have been possible, and even now he still has no explanation for what happened that day. When he was younger, he lived with his family in South Dakota. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood where most families knew each other, and kids often played outside together. It was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Most days followed the same routine: school in the morning, homework or games in the afternoon, dinner with family in the evening. At the time this happened, he was probably around 11 or 12 years old. He had just come home from school like he did every day. His parents were still at work, which meant he had the house to himself for a few hours. For a kid that age, having the house to yourself after school can feel like a small kind of freedom. You can play games, watch whatever you want on TV, or just relax without anyone telling you what to do. That afternoon, he did exactly what most kids would do. He went down to the basement to play video games. The basement was where his gaming setup was located. It was a finished basement with a television and a couch where he could sit and play for hours if he wanted. But even though it had been turned into a usable room, the basement still had that quiet underground feeling that basements tend to have. It always felt a little darker down there, even with the lights on. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the house, and there were only a couple small windows that let in natural light. Because of that, the space could sometimes feel a little closed in. Even as a kid, he never liked spending too much time in that basement alone. There wasn't a specific reason for the feeling. It was just something about the atmosphere of the place that made him uncomfortable. Still, that's where the video games were, so he went down there anyway. He turned on the console, sat down in front of the television, and started playing. For a while, everything felt normal. The sounds of the game filled the room, and he became focused on whatever level he was trying to beat at the time. When you're playing games as a kid, you tend to lose track of everything around you. Minutes turn into hours without you even noticing. That afternoon was no different. He had been playing for a while when something happened suddenly. Out of nowhere, something struck him in the back. It wasn't extremely hard, but it was strong enough that he felt it clearly. It felt like something small had been thrown and had hit him between his shoulders. The impact surprised him enough that he immediately stopped playing and turned around to see what had hit him. When he looked behind him, he saw something lying on the floor. It was a crumpled piece of paper. At first, he assumed someone must have thrown it at him as a joke. Maybe one of his parents had come home early and decided to mess with him. Or maybe one of his siblings had gotten home and snuck downstairs without him noticing. That seemed like the most logical explanation. So he stood up and looked around the basement. No one was there. The basement was completely empty. Still thinking someone must be in the house somewhere, he went upstairs to check. He walked through the living room. Nothing. He checked the kitchen. Still no one. He walked through the rest of the house looking for any sign that someone had come home. Yeah, but every room was empty. The house was completely silent. That's when another detail suddenly occurred to him. Their house had a security alarm system. Whenever someone entered the house while the alarm was armed, it would make a loud beeping sound as soon as the door opened. He knew that sound very well because he heard it every day when someone came home. But he hadn't heard it that afternoon. The house had been completely quiet the entire time he was playing. That thought made him uneasy. So he walked over to the alarm panel and looked at it. The alarm system was still armed. That meant no one had opened any of the doors. No one had entered the house. And yet something had hit him in the back. He went back down to the basement and looked at the piece of paper again. It was just a small, crumpled piece of paper, nothing special about it. But the question of how it got there bothered him more and more, the longer he thought about it. He knew he hadn't thrown it. He had been sitting still playing the game, and if no one else was in the house, there was no one who could have thrown it. The idea that something had been thrown at him while he was alone in the basement started to make his stomach feel tight with fear. He suddenly felt very uncomfortable being down there. That uneasy feeling he had always had about the basement came rushing back all at once. Instead of trying to figure it out further, he decided to leave. He ran upstairs, grabbed his shoes, and went straight out the front door. Without even stopping, he ran across the street to a neighbor's house. The neighbors knew him well, so when he knocked on their door, they let him come inside and sit there until someone from his family came home. He stayed there until his parents returned later that evening. Even after that day passed, the experience stuck with him. He never found out where the paper had come from. There was no explanation for how something could have hit him in the back when he was alone in a locked house. But one thing did change after that day. He stopped going into the basement alone. Even though it was where the video games were, he avoided it whenever possible. And whenever he did have to go down there, he made sure someone else was in the house with him, because after that afternoon, the basement never felt safe again. My brother and I grew up in a place that most people would probably describe as the middle of nowhere. When people hear that phrase, they often imagine a quiet neighborhood or maybe a small rural town. But our home was even more isolated than that. Our street was a dead-end road with almost nothing around it except forest, open land, and silence. There were only 8 houses on the entire road, and that included ours. Because of that, there were very few kids to play with. Between all the houses, there were only 4 other kids around our age. That meant most days my brother and I spent our time either together or with the same small group of friends. The street itself was long and curved gently through the land. If you ran from one end to the other and back again, it made a loop that was about a mile long. For 2 kids growing up in the countryside, it was perfect. We didn't have parks, malls, or arcades nearby. What we had was open space, dirt roads, and a lot of freedom. After school, we would often go outside and run that loop just for something to do. Sometimes we raced each other. Sometimes we just ran for exercise. Other times we ran because we were bored and needed something to burn off the endless energy kids seem to have. The road had different sections that each felt a little different. Some parts had houses close together. Some parts had thick trees on both sides that made the road feel like a tunnel. But there was one stretch of road that always felt different from the rest. It was the longest open section. On one side of the road there was a forest that seemed to go on forever. The trees were tall and packed close together. Even during the day, the inside of the woods looked darker than the surrounding land. On the other side of the road there was a huge field. The field wasn't maintained by anyone. It was just open land with tall grass that grew wild. Now, during the summer, the grass could grow up to your knees or even your thighs in some places. When the wind blew across it, the entire field would ripple like waves. When you ran past that area, it always felt strangely quiet compared to the rest of the road. The open field and the dark woods on the other side created a strange feeling like you were passing through a place where something could be hiding just out of sight. Now, one afternoon, my brother and I decided to go running like we had done so many times before. It was a normal day. Nothing about it felt unusual at first. The weather was calm and the air had that slightly cool feeling that comes in the late afternoon when the sun begins to drop lower in the sky. We started jogging down the road together, talking about random things the way brothers do when they're just trying to pass time. We hadn't even gotten very far. In fact, we were less than a quarter of a mile into our run when something happened that I still can't fully explain. As we reached the stretch where the forest ran along one side of the road and the tall grass field stretched across the other, something suddenly moved in the field. At first it was just motion. The tall grass shifted suddenly as if something large had been hiding in it and then burst out. Before we even had time to react, whatever it was, ran across the road directly in front of us and disappeared into the woods on the other side. The entire moment lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt much longer because of how strange the movement was. Whatever we saw was big, not the size of a small animal like a fox or a dog. It was large enough that when it came out of the grass, we could clearly see its body moving across the road. And the way it moved was the strangest part. It was running on 2 legs. At first, that might not sound strange, because humans run on 2 legs, but the movement didn't look human at all. The balance was completely wrong. When a person runs, their body leans forward slightly. Their arms move naturally with their steps. This thing didn't move like that. The best way I have ever been able to describe it is that it leaned backward as it ran, almost the way a bear does when it stands on its hind legs. But it wasn't slow like a bear standing upright. It was incredibly fast, faster than anything I had ever seen move on 2 legs. It crossed the entire road in what felt like a blink. For a moment, I just stood there trying to understand what I had seen. My brain kept trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a deer. There were plenty of deer in that area, but deer run on 4 legs. Even when they jump or leap, they don't run across the ground on two legs for that distance, and this thing had clearly run across the entire road upright. My brother was staring at the woods where it had disappeared. He looked just as shocked as I felt. Then he said something that made the situation even stranger. He said he thought he saw horns, or antlers. The idea of antlers made my mind jump back to deer again. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Even if a deer somehow stood upright for a second, it wouldn't be able to sprint across the road that way. And there was another detail that kept bothering me: the speed. It moved incredibly fast, much faster than any person could run, much faster than any animal I had ever seen moving upright. Whatever it was crossed from the tall grass field to the forest in seconds and then vanished completely among the trees. The woods swallowed it instantly. We stood there for a moment staring at the place where it had disappeared. Neither of us spoke. I remember feeling a strange tension in the air, like the moment when you suddenly realize something around you is wrong, but you don't know exactly why. Then, without saying anything to each other, we both made the same decision. We turned around, and we ran back the way we came. We didn't continue the run. We didn't try to investigate. We just went straight back home. The entire run back felt different from every other run we had ever done on that road. Instead of racing or joking around, we moved quickly and quietly, glancing over our shoulders more than once. Once we reached our house, we slowed down and tried to act normal. At first, we didn't even tell anyone what we had seen. It felt too strange to explain. Even saying it out loud made it sound ridiculous. Over the years, I thought about that moment many times. As I got older, I started trying to search online to see if anyone had ever reported seeing something similar. I looked for animals that might run on two legs. Now I looked for strange wildlife behavior. I even looked into stories and legends. The closest description I ever found that resembled what we saw was something people refer to as a wendigo. But even that explanation doesn't feel right to me. I don't claim to know what we saw. All I know is what I remember. Something large, running on two legs, moving faster than any person or animal should be able to move that way. And whatever it was, it disappeared into the woods, like it belonged there. To this day, I still think about that moment whenever I remember that road, because whatever crossed in front of us that afternoon was not human. And it definitely wasn't any normal animal either. If tonight's story stayed with you, leave a like. Subscribe if you're drawn to the quiet kind of horror, the kind that doesn't need to shout. Some things don't chase you, they just wait. This is LURK. I'll see you next time.